So in the last couple of years, the senior leadership of ISIS actually moved to Pakistan's Baluchistan. So all those fighters now started returning home. So the interesting part is a bunch of Uzbeks went back to Uzbekistan, and so the terrorists have been using them to recruit kind of the next generation. And the terrorists being ISIS, and then ISIS's Khorasan province, ISKP, and then Al-Qaeda, and they're usually doing it through the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. So basically there's three major terrorist groups recruiting in Uzbekistan. We really have no way to, as you can imagine, vet new terrorist recruits, right? So anyone coming to our southern border from Uzbekistan, if they were newly trained in a training camp, we don't know who they are. And right now the training camps are in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So if they're going to train with Al-Qaeda or, IMU is the short term of the Uzbek group, they train in Afghanistan. If they train with ISKP, the camps on the other side of the border in Tir Valley, Pakistan. So there's thousands of people going through these camps and targeting our border. It's very dangerous. Like I said, there is no way to vet them because they don't have prior records in our system.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
We cut through the partisan talking points. We're not interested in perpetuating fear. We're interested in seeking truth, hearing what's really going on America's borderland. Welcome to Borderland, an Ironclad original. My guest today is Sarah Adams. Sarah is an acclaimed targeting officer and global threat advisor with significant experience both domestically and internationally. From 2015 to 2017, she served as a senior advisor to the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on Benghazi. She also served overseas on behalf of the U.S. government's intelligence mission in Europe, Middle East, North Africa, South Asia as an award-winning targeting officer at the CIA. Here's our conversation about terrorism and the southern border. It's terrifying. This podcast is about the border, right? And so, there's many different branches of this border conversation, from immigration to drugs to cartels, and blah, 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 so on and so forth, policy, everything you can think of. But I think really in this, we can go wherever you want with this, but I think the space where I think I would be interested in hearing your opinions on is in the potential for terrorist attacks on America. And so that's what I'd love to talk about. Before we get started, if you wouldn't mind, would you mind giving a brief bio for the audience?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sarah Adams. I'm a former CIA targeter. Right now, I actually I'm in the government still, but I work for the Department of Defense, and I'm working on research and development projects and programs. So mostly helping with big data analytics. So a little away from my old targeting career. So I'm not doing intelligence collection or anything like that. But on the side, I run a private investigation to identify the terrorists who committed the 2012 Benghazi attacks. And we've identified now 164 of those terrorists. So that's an active and ongoing investigation. And that's pretty much my background. I spent, about a decade at the CIA. I spent a couple years in Congress on the Select Committee in Benghazi, and then a few years in the private sector working with JetBlue. So I know a lot about aviation threats as well.
I'm interested in hearing it all. With this podcast, it was just something that I've just been curious. I formerly was a Border Patrol agent for 7 years, and when I wrote the book about the Border Patrol, it was really in efforts to try and give the average person more information on what's happening with the Border Patrol career field from that stance. It seemed to rub people the wrong way, and other people appreciate it. It was this really weird kind of phenomenon that I wasn't expecting. I didn't realize how volatile this subject can be. As much as I thought it was, I didn't realize personally, I got attacked like crazy for writing a book about the Border Patrol. And so I was really confused. Then I started doing a lot of interviews and really kind of digging in deeper to kind of better understand it. And I was I partnered with Ironclad to do this podcast because I felt well, let's try and interview experts in their field in all the facets of this conversation. And when I saw you online, I was very interested in hearing your opinion on, what's going on. Currently, you've seen massive influx of immigration or illegal immigration at our borders. Some are masked as claiming political asylum. Some are claiming political asylum. Some are just smuggling drugs. Some are circumventing our system because they're trying to hide their personal identity And those are all concerns. When talking about this, you have this emotional pull both sides. One, people, someone I've interviewed before was like, there's no person that's illegal. Like that ideology, it stems from having empathetic views toward people seeking asylum. But that argument alone misses the Homeland Security threat. And on the other side, the Homeland Security threat of like, close all the borders, don't let anyone in. And then it got like, okay, well, you're missing the viewpoint of someone who genuinely probably needs assistance based on their country's, persecution or whatnot and seeking asylum. And so, I think it's only fair to give everyone a fair voice and give them a platform to say their opinion.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm actually on both sides of the coin, actually, because I work on evacuating persons from Afghanistan. And then on the other side, I work on the threats against the persons being issued like fraudulent documents, in Afghanistan to come here, right? So I do see both sides of the coin. There is, of course, a humanitarian element of it, but when you only focus on, hey, let's rescue as many people as possible, et cetera, and you set aside things like vetting and stuff, you do bring in the bad apples. And one thing I like to tell people is one bad apple ruins this whole program for us, right? Like we get an Afghan in this country that commits an attack, it shuts down the program for all the good, allies we're trying to bring in, and it puts those people at threat. If I'm going to bring someone to America to keep them safe, I don't want them hurt here. And we have had Afghans killed in America since we brought them here. And so this is a really horrible thing. And I wish people would actually see that side of things and why we don't want the criminal elements coming here.
Yeah, when you say you've had Afghans that you brought allies, guys who've worked with us, special operations guys overseas, then you've brought them here, helping them seek asylum, and they too have then been targeted and killed?
Correct, yes.
Who were they killed by? Is it the threat, I guess, if you will?
Yeah, well, there's been numerous situations. Most of it has been, unfortunately, petty crime. We've had several Uber drivers killed or, or beat, those type of things. And then there have been some, within their communities. And the negative is we did bring in people we shouldn't have brought in, right? We've brought in war criminals, terrorists. Some of these communities are very difficult to be in, as you can imagine, because they know who each other is, right? And you really can't hide when you get into these immigrant communities, unfortunately, and people do get targeted.
Yeah, and they tend to kind of find the culture that they, resonate with. And, those Afghan communities become, inundated with more Afghan community or Afghans. And then, yeah, I guess in that there's little factions in there that could potentially put you at risk. Crazy.
Yeah.
Well,
the thing, though, that the biggest risk, though, unfortunately, is so they're getting identified in the United States, and then they're basically being targeted and lured back to Afghanistan. And it's different ruses, right? Like, we're going to marry off a family member of yours to a terrorist. A lot of their wives and children are still in in Afghanistan. The United States haven't finished the processing yet. It's a huge mess. So they're luring them back to Afghanistan because bad actors in America know they're here, they identified them, and now they're blackmailing them, bringing them back, they're kidnapping them, torturing them, and then they're saying, hey, when you return to the United States, you now work for us, you follow all orders, or we'll kill your entire family in Afghanistan. It's a very, very dangerous situation that people are ignoring, and it's a huge threat to our ally community.
Absolutely. I'd never heard any of this before. I do know several other guys who have organizations that are helping bringing some of our allies back and getting them in through the asylum process. I do know one of the lawyers that I interviewed here, he asked for my assistance. So I would love to send you his information. Maybe you can help him with the same thing process. He's working with several Afghans that he's trying to get in. What is the vetting system that you guys use currently to make sure that you're bringing, allies that have, good intentions?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously only help allies who I personally know or who were like the wife or spouse or family members of Americans. So those are the ones I have assisted. So obviously pretty much pre-vet, most of them had homes in America. The sad part is it was summer in Afghanistan. And so a lot of women and children went back to their homeland of Afghanistan, or at least where their parents were from, to visit the grandparents for the holiday. And then the men were here, obviously still working in America. So a lot of people who got left behind in Afghanistan were women and children. That's ignored completely. I had like 2 women and 8 children, all Americans, blue passport holders from Chicago. And I had to get them flown out on a private plane from a company down here in Tampa called Project Dynamo. And basically the CEO of it went over there himself and got them for me and put them on a plane. I mean, it was that bad that we had to have private American citizens go in and get these actual Americans.
Yeah, I've never heard that. So because of the season, the men stayed back and the men stayed home to work and the women went back to visit. And
Like the grandparents. Yeah.
Yeah, I never heard that story. That's crazy. Yeah, I know that there's a lot of friends, coming from the special operations community, a lot of guys worked with, allies out there that needed some assistance. And I know several guys, who went out there and, have assisted since. So with our Mexican American border, the big threat for me is because like I said, I see on both sides as well. I'm empathetic towards it all. I understand it all. At the same time, like someone who's done, tours overseas, seen really bad dudes, know the potential and the connections from a lot of those guys from overseas who are the connections to people here in America, knowing some of the threats that have been stopped before it even happened. Then you see what's happening currently on our borders and knowing that the massive influx of, let's just say Chinese nationals currently, there's a massive influx of Chinese nationals, but not even that. They're shedding their documents, right? They're throwing them to the wayside. They're hiding their identities. And then it raises the question is why? And so those are a lot of the things that I'm seeing currently and what we've been getting reports from people that we interview. And that raises a question, that raises some fears, but I don't know how realistic those fears are. And I'm curious to know, maybe in your opinion, maybe from your expertise, what you think.
Sure. I mean, I think if we, put things in different classes, right? So obviously the China thing is a strategic threat, right? It's the fact that those persons have a loyalty to their country. And if they get called upon, they will serve their country, right? I think that's the biggest fear with Chinese. And really one of the biggest problems with them is numerous countries have no requirements. So in Ecuador, like a Chinese citizen doesn't need a visa, right? So they fly to Ecuador and come up. So they didn't even really need to do some sort of vetting process ahead of time to even come here. That's why it's also easy to shed their documents, right? They're kind of unknowns. But when you look at some of the other groupings of people, I mean, I spend a lot of time on Afghans, but let's just move over to other countries in the region. Let's do Uzbekistan, for example, right? So we've had 3,000 Uzbeks come into our country in the last 7 months. The really interesting thing a lot of people don't understand is a lot of Uzbeks went and fought with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So in the last couple of years, the senior leadership of ISIS actually moved to Pakistan's Baluchistan. So all those fighters now started returning home. So the interesting part is a bunch of Uzbeks went back to Uzbekistan. And so the terrorists have been using them to recruit kind of the next generation. And the terrorists being ISIS, and then ISIS's Khorasan province, ISKP, and then Al-Qaeda. And they're usually doing it through the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. So basically there's 3 major terrorist groups recruiting in Uzbekistan. We really have no way to, as you can imagine, vet new terrorist recruits, right? So anyone coming to our southern border from Uzbekistan, if they were newly trained in a training camp, we don't know who they are. And right now the training camps are in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So if they're going to train with Al-Qaeda or, IMU is the short term of the Uzbek group, they train in Afghanistan. If they train with ISKP, the camps on the other side of the border in Tir Valley, Pakistan. So there's thousands of people going through these camps and targeting our border. It's very dangerous. Like I said, there is no way to vet them because they don't have prior records in our system.
How about this? What if someone comes from Uzbekistan and just claims political asylum? Are they able to claim political asylum from that country right now?
I mean, maybe if there's some sort of unique group and the government, might have some sort of crackdown on them. But other than that, I mean, I don't know why we have an influx, as you can imagine, of 7,000. It's 3,000. It's very dangerous. Just a few years ago, we only had 700 Uzbeks for the entire year come to our border, right? So people need to keep in mind some of these numbers. Another really big problem is India, right? So most Indians, right? I mean, the poor class really is coming here, for what they say, right? An economic thing, which is what we hear from most people in Latin America. But there are members of ISIS flying on these flights. And the really interesting part is, I don't know if you remember in March, but one of the flights landed in Paris and they're like, what the heck? Who are these 400 Indians on here? Like the French couldn't vet them. Well, what people don't realize is those flights have now been diverted and they're leaving India and they're going to Benghazi. So they go to Benghazi, Libya, and then they're flying to Nicaragua. So 2 weeks ago, two flights, so two like big Boeings, like the whole 400 people, they left from Benghazi on a local Libyan airline that basically only flies to Tunisia and Turkey, and they landed in Nicaragua. So like 800 Indians. So private chartered plane, it's not clear they went through any sort of vetting process, and everybody on the both planes was to come to the U.S. border. So we have to also look at these countries allowing these flights to land, allowing these unvetted persons that they know are just coming to go to our border. You know, the US has a lot of carrots and sticks. Why aren't we putting more pressure on these Latin American countries, issuing these visas, offering these flight clearances? I'm sorry, Gadames Air it's like a dinky airline in Libya. Like no country should be allowing it to land. To be honest, in Libya, one of a very senior terrorist actually owns an airline. Like I wouldn't let a Libyan airline land on my soil to begin with. So it's just a huge problem.
Yeah, that's scary. And most of those individuals, first of all, the cost of what that is, who's paying that, which always concerns me. The farther the trip, who's paying that bill? And it blows my mind because it's always a concern. Like, man, that someone has a lot of money. And for me, if you have that kind of money, why leave? You're the king of your own castle wherever you're at. And so to come to our country, there's always a concern for me. I don't understand that. But not even that is, you know, they're chartering down to Ecuador and then they're making their way up through our borders. And then what? You know, like you said, there's no vetting system. Our system, I don't know how many countries we can actually identify their past history, right? Their past criminal history, but not a lot of them. And so people coming from India in that manner, yeah, those numbers have been through the roof as well recently.
Yeah, and like some countries we can't vet at all, like Syria, right? We have no relationship with that government. We can't vet them. But the really smart thing is some of these people, like in Afghanistan, what they're doing is basically having these terrorists come in and then they're checking their biometrics and making sure they were never in our system before sending them to our border. So they're pre-planning to ensure we don't have biometrics on the terrorists they're sending. So they're being smart about this too.
Man, that's that's crazy. I don't understand. Like, I guess, you know, we've had 3 years of like massive influx of immigration, and there hasn't really been a serious threat. There's been small little gangs popping up, you know, a lot of the shootings that are happening in New York and some violence here and there. What is it that a terrorist organization is probably looking for the timing? Like when would they strike, or are they looking for an opportune time? I'm always curious, like, are they just sitting there? You know, it's almost like I've called it before, like the Trojan horse. Like, are they just sitting here in America waiting for the right time to attack, or are they just coming to America and actually just trying to live a life and try and go straight? I don't understand it. And I'm just kind of curious. Maybe is there intel out there that kind of has, you know, an idea of why we're just kind of sitting stagnant right now with no threat currently?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to every group, unfortunately. You know, we recently did have the strange situation, though, you know, at the Marine base by the Jordanians. You know, one was on the terrorist watch list. It's been completely covered up, right? But the thing is, so if we just talk Al Qaeda, so Al Qaeda senior leadership is based in Afghanistan. Basically, they do have a plot in place for the U.S. homeland. It's multiple coordinated plots. It's for 2025. And that timing is contingent on what happens in Gaza because they are supplying a lot of new trainees and recruits right now to fight in Iraq and Syria. It's being completely covered up and only called ISIS, but they're attacking US and Israeli interests there. So as of now, it's slotted for 2025. So they're basically pre-training and pre-deploying all the terrorists actually to the United States, but they've actually made a whole new model. So, you know, in the old day, they would make like a terrorist cell, and then you'd have the leader of the cell, and then they would all train together, and then they knew what they're training for and would practice and all those things. Now they're pre-training, and one of the things they're pre-training in is, interestingly, urban warfare. They're forward deploying the commanders to the US, and they're also doing this to Europe. And then in the future, that commander will be the one that tells them, okay, this is what you're hitting. So even if you pull these people in the secondary, you might get them to admit they went to like an Al Qaeda training camp, but they have no clue what their target is. They don't. There's no way to get it out of them. They're not taught it. in Afghanistan at camps because they don't want us to get ahead of it. So they've also been really smart about how they're preparing for the future attack. And this is going to basically be the big one. That's the retaliation, as you can imagine, for Osama bin Laden.
Oh man, I haven't thought about that, man. And that's just that's just information from one country. I guess, is China a threat to us in America?
Yeah, I mean, China is a major threat to us, right? The scary thing about China, though, is they're patient, right? They'll spend 100 years to do their objective, So one of the things I've seen, they're really smart. What they did in Turkey is they kind of wanted like command and control of like the airport, right? So the interesting part is they started buying obviously all like the power lines around it. They paid for all the infrastructure of the roads to even now where they run like the tower, right? When planes come in, the Chinese government basically run it. And so now the whole area within who knows how many miles of the main airport in Istanbul, the Chinese run, right? They're very smart about making sure they have this control of the infrastructure for when they need it, right? So we even see like simple things in Afghanistan because they're now in Kabul. They're wiring the entire city almost like a smart city with CCTV, right? Why are they really going to need that in Afghanistan? It's not for the Taliban; it's for the Chinese to be able to use it in the future for whatever they believe is going to happen. Obviously, they likely believe the Taliban will fall, and they're preparing for a future regardless. But other things they're doing there is like they've made a deal with the Iranians, for example, to move oil across Afghanistan to China. They're not even doing it yet. They're saying, hey, if the US does a blockade and we can't bring up oil from like Africa and South America, like we're going to need another place to do it in. And so that's like a deal they're brokering, in Afghanistan, and no one's paying any attention to it. So China's very smart. They're thinking the long game, and it's a lot about infrastructure, right? Like if they control huge portions of our ports or huge parts of our electric grid, they can turn things off and shut things down when they need to, and if they need to, if a war happens. So that's the way we should look at China. Very long-term threat, very systematic, and they're way ahead of us in their planning, in preparation for this.
Yeah, I've kind of always thought like there's a weird psyop from them happening ongoing through social media, through film and television, through, so on and so forth, but also like the purchasing of land and supporting infrastructure down in South America, right? That's happening as we speak. And that's like, man, that's weird, but also purchasing of land here in America inside internally. Right. And so all of that is a concern, you know what I mean? I think maybe the average person doesn't hear that. I know sometimes I'm surrounded by, people in the government who always talk. And so you hear these things, but those are all concerns of mine. In the intel world, dissemination of information seems to be not slow, but like acted on. Like you always hear things like 9/11, like, oh, the FBI knew that this was going to happen, but no one acted on it. Or all these events. There's a lot of events I could say an example. What is it about the intel world that we're not taking action? Is it almost like the boy who cried wolf, too afraid to make the wrong decision, or what is that?
I think, unfortunately, it's become this politicalization of our intelligence and law enforcement communities. I won't say what organization they were in, but just a few weeks ago, I talked to someone who was pretty senior, and we were talking about the border, mostly from the terror side of it, because I was concerned. And they said, Sarah, we've been giving marching orders. The only things we can talk about and the only things we can focus on is the feeder country. So like where illegals are going and blame them. So we can blame like a Brazil, we can blame an Ecuador, we can blame a Nicaragua, but we can't talk about enforcement on our own border and our own policies. Like it's like there's basically a steam down on that. And so a lot of people have to realize a lot of these decisions are made to appease politics and focusing on the next election. And we keep doing our national security in these cycles, and it's very dangerous. And we're only hurting our national security. And obviously, the enemy, no matter who it is, if it's a terrorist group, if it's a drug cartel, or if it's a nation state like China, I mean, they're taking advantage of this. And even China is really smart. We talk about, oh, yeah, the Belt Road, and they have all this infrastructure in Latin America, but just the relationships with the cartels like are very concerning, and it's something we should focus on. Like even when we talk about Afghanistan, like the meth coming out of Afghanistan, it's the Taliban or it's Siraj Haqqani, the Haqqani network's doing with China, and they're bringing it to Mexico. So both the Haqqani network and China have very established relationships with the drug cartel networks. I mean, those relationships aren't just in Mexico. Now, when they come into the United States, those relationships are enduring, and it's very dangerous when we get people from any of those countries who have these kind of relationships in our country, because it isn't just about terrorism. There's a lot of crime involved.
Yeah. It's like when I don't talk about this per se subject often because it is like intimidating. Right? I could talk about illegal immigration. I could talk about the drug trafficking. I could talk about transnational organizations that are all involved in this whole trafficking deal. But when you start talking about potential terrorist threats and potential future threats on this country, it gets scary. It's something that I think a lot of people aren't ready to hear or uncomfortable to hear, because then you almost fear. It's like fear mongering in a way, but it's not. Like those who are in high positions have been hearing these threats or have been hearing these ideas. And like currently right now, like I don't know who doesn't feel the same way about the way the kind of the border situation is happening right now. Remove politics and just what is happening right now has to be scary for the average person to see, because those of us who spent a lifetime chasing the worst dudes ever are always intimidated by like, well, that's an easy area to egress or to come into this country. Mm-hmm. For me, from a tactical standpoint, like, well, if I was going to be the bad guy, I would do the same. You know what I mean? I'd find the fastest way of approach or the easiest approach of what's working, and I'd use that. And then I'd kind of find my way, hide myself in that country, in plain sight, if you will, and then just wait for the call, wait for the time to do my job. And that's seriously scary. And in your opinion, like, are we, besides the ones that you know of, right? Do you fear other countries? And what are the lists of those countries that you kind of look towards, or at least kind of like, I'd be mindful of?
Yeah, I mean, I think the top is Iran, right? If we're talking terrorism, they're our biggest threat. They have a hidden hand, be it Al Qaeda, be it Hezbollah, be it Hamas, be it Taliban. They have a relationship with all these groups, right? They view us as their number one enemy, and we should take that serious. And then obviously the second to that would be Afghanistan, right? Leaving Kabul the way we did, we created the greatest terrorist safe haven to ever exist. Al Qaeda alone has 30 training camps right now in Afghanistan. I try to explain to people, after the fall of Gaddafi, Al Qaeda did go and try to create a base in Libya. They had about 5 training camps. I mean, look at how bad Libya got. Even ISIS took over a portion of the country, in the years that followed. So people need to understand, Afghanistan is like 50 times worse than that, right? So in the past, we were forward deployed, right? We were taking on the enemy in their own home, right? If they were in a terrorist camp, we were attacking them at that terrorist camp, right? Now, for 2.5 years, they've gone through training at these terrorist camps, graduated from training, and deployed. They've moved out, right? We've stopped even targeting the terrorist training camps, and people need to understand we aren't going after terrorism the way we did. And so the threat is so much higher now, and we look so much weaker to these terrorists. And now, after Afghanistan, they think they can defeat us, and they're planning to.
Yeah, I remember during my time in, one of the biggest targets that we would be doing missions towards is dismantling, disrupting training organizations, right? And so now they've had 2 years with no interruptions, none of us there to kind of, take them out slowly or kill or capture, right? The missions that most, special operations units did. And so now they've had 2 years to build up to become the strongest fighting forces they possibly can to retaliate on us. That's a scary thought. And, I guess my mind goes like, who's training them and how good are they? It's irrelevant for me to think that, because who are they actually attacking are those who are not trained, right? Who they were going after will potentially be those who your casual, civilian who doesn't think and train and do things like special operations people do. And so they're good enough, if you will.
Right. But the one thing you also need to realize is there was a lot of terrorists that we believe were killed, and they're not. There are some of these senior terrorists. One is a Taliban member. His name is Corey Zero Rockman, right? He's one of the main people between the Taliban and Al Qaeda training program. Like he's as hard as it gets. I think any American who worked against him would be very concerned, right? That he's training people who are coming to America. Another terrorist that doesn't really get talked about, his name is Abu Khabib al-Libi. He actually was a huge trainer during the Bosnian Mujahideen era. A lot of people thought the Russians killed him. They locked him up for years. And he, of course, like most terrorists, showed up after the fall of Afghanistan. And he is now one of the senior trainers. So they do have people who've been in the fight 20, 30 years. They fought in Iraq, they fought in Algeria, they fought in Libya, they fought in Afghanistan. These are very seasoned trainers. They're very smart. A lot of them have been detained by us or at least another power, like even being detained by the Russians, right? You learn a lot about your enemy. You learn a lot about your enemy's gaps. And then you learn different ways to work within the boundaries of how your enemy does things, right? And you get really smart to stay off their radar.
This is scary. All right, I'm gonna, and if I have to cut this out, I will. I don't care. But I was contacted by someone recently and said I should be looking into a specific organization. I'm going to say the organization, and you let me know if you've ever heard of it, and maybe if you're interested, tell me what you know of it. But an Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Is that a familiar term to you?
No, I mean, I don't know really that one. To be blunt, I know it comes off conspiratorial, but really one of the biggest issues, in the United States is unfortunately the Muslim Brotherhood. They are kind of the financial force behind kind of like all the NGOs and the type of the do-gooders, right, who actually are bringing in terrorists. They're banned in multiple countries, right? Like the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, even Qatar has them banned, but in the United States, we don't have them banned. And I really think they're one of the biggest problems. Now, when you look at an organization like that, and then you look down their funding mechanism, to be honest, it's likely going to be the Muslim Brotherhood, or it'll even be someone like Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda is a multi-billion-dollar organization. They run as a business more times than they run as guys with guns. And a lot of people lose sight of that, right? Like, so the Hajj travel to Saudi Arabia years ago, Al Qaeda's like, hey, we should get in on this. It'd be really smart, right? We get into the consular sections at embassies. We get into travel agencies. It brings us visas. And so Al Qaeda now runs a huge percentage of the Hajj travel for the entire world, right? So we have to also look at terrorist groups as businesses. And then even when you bring up, a company like this, double check that they don't actually link back to things like Al Qaeda or the Muslim Brotherhood, because most do, because that's where the biggest dollars can come from. You can't, unless a foreign government is funding you, like Iran, there's only certain places that can put billions into you, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I have a independent journalist that's like, hey man, this is what I've been finding, and so we're gonna look further into it for not just for the podcast, but just to deeper dive. And I'm curious about it. It's who they believe is helping a lot of the trafficking from transnational organizations all across the world, and so it's an interesting thing. But I thought it might have kind of aligned with some of the things you were talking about.
Well, one thing I would really focus on though is Turkey, right? I mean, we talked about those Uzbeks that came to the border. A number of them actually link back to ISIS networks in Turkey. The ISIS networks in Turkey are very powerful because they supplied the Syrian civil war, and the Syrian civil war has been basically the greatest jihad in the last 10 years, and that's pretty much where I think most trafficking of terrorists falls back to would be Turkey and the organizations around who supplied fighters to Syria.
I'm curious for the numbers of Turkey that's been entering into this country illegally currently, but I do know there is a massive number of uptick of that exact country. Which,
yeah, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me, but the Turks, they'll move any. I mean, they move so many Libyans. They move a lot of people from Tunisia. I mean, a lot of North Africans are getting actually moved, by the Turkish government, to Syria. So it is a big problem. But they also, as you can imagine, have the power, the influence, the connections, because they've been doing it for so long. they have the networks. And that's something we always have to keep in mind, right? Who has these historic networks to do X, Y, and Z, right? Even if you talk about like weapons, right? The weapons moved to Hamas, for example, right? Well, who had the historic networks, right? Obviously, Al Qaeda in Libya is one, right? Al Qaeda in Afghanistan is one, right? And so we always have to remember, too, this really goes back to a lot of the old actors, and they enable all these type of things.
Scary, scary stuff. I'm just trying to wrap my head around, how as a country, let me ask this question, how as a country could we make steps in our government or policies made that can help protect our nation even more so? Because right now it feels like, things that are in place aren't in our advantage to protect our homeland security.
Yeah, I mean, I know people call it racist, but I do believe in bans on countries that we can't get background checks on, right? So Syria, for example, if you're not going to give us background details on your citizens, right, they'll never come to the United States. There should be a travel ban. There used to be one in Libya. Libya didn't even have things like social security numbers for the country, right? They've now been forced to improve those type of things, and obviously they're not banned anymore. But that is important. Another thing really is we're letting in too many people, right? You cannot effectively vet the numbers that have come in, and then when we have people, we mark them, let's say, as a special interest alien. I mean, you've been in BORTAC, right? How many resources it takes to surveil someone, right? So when they come in the country and we're like, oh, they're special interests, nobody's following them, nobody's tracking on them, nobody's seeing who they're making acquaintances with, right? So we need to actually significantly limit who's coming into this country. And then we do need to probably increase resources on vetting. And then honestly, I know people aren't going to like it, but we're going to have to start deporting the criminals and terrorists we've brought in, right? And like they need to go through processes, they need to go through a legal system, and then they need to be sent home.
Yeah. The one thing I do know that the Border Patrol, when they do apprehend someone who pops up with a former or past criminal record, they are deported. And I'll say this, I know there are certain sectors I know for a fact I don't know about across the board because it seems like every sector or every state has kind of different policies in place for their own. But I know that there's a good portion of people who are definitely getting deported once they've identified that they have prior criminal history. But
yeah, the problem is though, if they don't know who they are, it takes time, right? So if you dropped your ID or even you have a fake ID, now you have, I don't know, some Brazilian passport, right? And then a year or two later, we decide, oh, you slipped through the cracks, right? We need to be a lot more aggressive on finding the people who slipped through the cracks. They weren't vetted properly. Also, we really need a lot more people with common sense to be sitting down, right? If someone says they're from a certain country, I want someone in the room from that country to have a conversation with them so they can be like, yeah, I spent an hour with that guy, BS, he ain't Syrian, right? Or whatever he's saying he is. We need a lot more of FaceTime with these people, really to have people make those decisions. I know it's extra resources, but, we're talking about the national security of our country. And, we used to be really good at these things. And I think it's fallen by the wayside.
Yeah, I think after 9/11, it's like right away, we're reactive, not proactive, right? And so, hey, now we're very, very particular about our things. Now we still have TSA who seems to do pat checks on me every single time. But all the implementation of these things happened because of 9/11. But then after years of nothing, right, or to the public eye, nothing, then it kind of gets more laxed. When I was a border patrol agent, I know everyone claimed they were Mexican, right, because they wanted to get deported back to Mexico to make the trip faster. And then right away, with basic conversation of Spanish, there's different dialects or different right. words for different things, and you're able to identify that. And so, yeah, I can see that. It's interesting. Let me ask this question. Say you find some information on the border, right? And it seems to be sensitive information. What's the 3-letter agency, or what's the agency that's actually going to take action in doing something about it? Because right now it feels like I don't know what that is. I'll say that.
I don't know what it is either. Obviously I've worked as I told you, Afghan refugees. And when you work on an area like that and with so many different Afghans, as you can imagine, I've come across bad actors, right? And I've tried to report it here and there and everywhere, right? And there is no mechanism to where there's people I've reported. One guy actually, he's Taliban, beheaded his own wife. He's still processing to come to America. So, yeah, if there is a system in place, even someone like me who was years in the CIA, I can't get traction on stopping even just the bad actors who aren't even here yet to come in. So yeah, I think the ones in the country, you're kind of on your own, and you really need to spend time on the community level looking at these threats and finding different ways to be better prepared for it. Because community level, a lot of those people never really worked terrorism, right? It really never was in their backyard, and now they maybe need to start thinking through some of these different threats and how things look out of place. I think the greatest example, like kind of the box truck threat, right? It is the
Mm-hmm.
easiest to do if you're in a local community to be on top of, because it is a terrorist focus. So start educating people on things like that. At least it's to do something at the community level.
That's scary to think that someone that was at your level in the government, still works for the government, doesn't have an answer for where we can report things that we know can be a national threat. And
Yeah, I
and
mean,
I
you could
I've
do the
seen it
FBI
personally.
tip line, but you don't know if they don't get back to you. You don't know if they contacted anyone. There's no follow up.
Is that normally an FBI probably process, or is that Secret Service? Is that CIA? Like, who would probably fall under the jurisdiction? We don't know, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you'd think it's FBI, and then FBI would say it's somebody random, like, I don't know, like something at the border or HSI. And then someone would be like, oh no, if you're complaining that they might be on a fake visa, that could be like Department of State's command center. Like it's really like nobody's taking the wheel, and everyone has a different opinion depending on what you're saying that they're doing wrong or what crime they're committing as part of their movement to the United States, right? Is it a trafficking component? Is it a visa fraud component, right?
Yeah.
Are they a terrorist, but a terrorist never watch listed? That's difficult, right? You got to just get someone to believe you. Oh yeah, trust me, bro. He's a terrorist, right? So it's like
Yeah.
this whole system that doesn't actually work well together.
Yeah, that's the problem. It's the dissemination of information across all letter agencies. You know what I mean? And this is definitely something I think that needs to be addressed. We need to find, maybe it is Department of Homeland Security stands up a whole new section. Maybe someone takes over this department and actually does something about it. Maybe it's the FBI. I don't know what it is, but I've had people call me like, hey, I know for a fact this. I'm like, man, I don't even know where to send you. I have a ton of
Mm-hmm.
friends in the contracting world. I have a ton of friends who have been all the different spaces with your department, everything, and no one has an answer for that. Like, I don't have an answer for it, and I work for the Department of Homeland Security. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, you know what I mean. So it's how crazy is that's a concern currently right now, and no one knows where to go.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. I complain about this all the time, just for the movement of terrorists. Remember, our attackers, we don't even have most of them watch listed. We can't find someone to watch list the terrorists who came and killed two CIA officers and an ambassador and another State Department officer. That's how bad it is. There's not even a system to effectively do that. If something's not generated and auto generated with inside the US government, it's very hard to get outside information into the government and to get them to take it seriously.
How, just slight change of subject. I mean, you've kind of worked in the space of this. I mean, I assume with CIA, but do you believe there's spies in our country?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Absolutely. Okay. And say, what is the process for that? If you identify someone you believe might be a spy, is there a process that for sure for that one?
I don't exactly think there is. I actually got information on the double agent late last year. Luckily they're not in the United States, and so I was like, I'll pass it to the CIA, right? That makes sense. And I've never even got a response on it. And that's a double agent. So yeah, if there is, I mean, I'm assuming it's a counterintelligence department at FBI is who I'd assume you pass it to. Now, how you get it to them and have to send it to some random tip line and hope the person working the tip line understands the nuance of it or the importance of it. I just don't know. I mean, I have a big problem, as you can imagine, with like the rewards for justice. That's where people are supposed to go for terrorism type of stuff. And I send foreigners there all the time. They end up interacting with someone who has no idea what they're talking about, as you can imagine. They say weird things like, send me everything you know. I had a guy, he's been working terrorists 40 years. He said, Sarah, this chick told me to send her everything I know. He's like, I have like full hard drives of terrorist information. Like, what is she talking about? And he finally just ended the conversation. He's like, this person's incompetent. Like, think about it. Those are who foreigners even have to interact with to pass off information. I've interacted with Rewards for Justice and actually ended up blocking them. They're so incompetent. So yeah, so it's very frustrating. There is not proper systems to pass off any sort of threat information in the United States. You just have to get lucky and have like one champion who's competent to do it for you, sadly.
I had no idea that was the answer, because that's disheartening to know that there really is no real path currently that is showing any kind of effect. The Mexican border, obviously they have a new president, and I'm not sure. How do you feel about the new president? Do you know anything about that?
I mean, I don't know anything about her to make an opinion, unfortunately.
Yeah. The Mexican side of our border is a intimidating one, because it feels like there is no real order to the control of the cartel or any kind of criminal organization. It feels like they kind of, they're free to do as they please, and that becomes a concern. The last person I interviewed said that the cartel was mentioning to him, as a journalist, he's a journalist that is close with the cartel and reports on them. They're excited to hear if Trump wins, because that would mean that it's harder to get across, which means the prices for crossing go up, which is the kind of thing that like I never expected to hear in that conversation, which, this is the concern I have. It's like I feel like, with people like you with your experience and the people like him with their experience, I'm not seeing answers that put America in a place where I can feel safe. And that's scary.
I mean, I think one of the issues we get our head wrapped around it with, right, is hey, these cartels are so powerful, right? They control Mexico and we can't do anything about it. I think the thing we can do something about and we don't is basically when they cross our border, right? I mean, there's U.S. companies, U.S. persons assisting them, in the trafficking of whatever it is, or involved in any sort of crime they're involved in. Like, we do have power to affect the people in the United States, right? Like, we really need to be going after the enablers of these cartels in the United States, and making the business difficult for them. And I really don't think we do things like that. I think we view the cartel issue as outside or in Mexico, and we don't view the networks the way we should and target them the way we should in the United States. And it's for multiple reasons. One, they're in the United States, right? They're now basically a US citizen status. It makes it more difficult. And sometimes when something's more difficult, people aren't going to go, die in that hill for it, right? They're like, we're going to stick to the low hanging fruit. I'm not putting my neck out or my career out to go after this, whatever, this gang network in Maryland, right? Like, it's not going to benefit my career, for example. And it's a huge broken system we have going. And I think maybe we should rethink how we classify U.S. citizen status to allow more operations to occur in the United States.
Yeah. One of my guests talked about how, he believes there's cartel inundated throughout, America, for some reason, when there is, a killing that is connected to drugs and cartel, it's not talked about as publicly for some reason. Right. And that's just a crazy concept. Jason Jones, we interviewed him, and he's just fascinating. He's here in Texas, and he's doing all the work he can to kind of exploit that. For those who, when I talk about 9/11, I've talked about several times publicly, and people come back and say, yeah, but those people were all here on a visa. They were here legally. And so then the threat that they posed the conversation that the threat of a terrorist attack because of the illegal immigration is, again, fear mongering, because anytime there's been a terrorist attack in here, it's been a citizen, American citizen, or someone who's here legally. I would love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, well, actually, they were here legally because Al Qaeda determined at the time that U.S. student visas were the easiest visa to get. And that's why they chose to get them student visas. Now, Al Qaeda has decided, hey, it's easiest just to go over the U.S. southern border. And so they're sending terrorists to Iran, to Turkey, and then they're flying to places like Brazil and whatnot and coming up. So the terrorists at different times will make different decisions. So yeah, the student visa was easiest then. That's why they targeted it. Taliban has even made a slightly different focus. They've said, hey, since all these countries, not just US, are so willing to bring in Afghans, let's actually hunt down who actually at some time is a Taliban and served with the US government or the British government or the German government and can go through a legal refugee process, into those countries and then operate on our behalf. So they still are looking at the legal visa processes and seeing how they can do it. Another thing too is what a lot of people don't realize, this war has been going on for 20 years. Like Al-Qaeda, for example, has visa officers at embassies, right? In Turkey, an Al-Qaeda leader was running like the Libyan and the embassy in Malaysia and issuing visas for years to terrorists, right? In Afghanistan, you can go there from any country and get an Afghan passport, right? You can be Iraqi, Egyptian, Syrian, it doesn't matter. So a lot of people need to realize too, there are now terrorists within these legitimate networks, and they're still trying to get legitimate visas, as you can imagine, because it puts them in a better position wherever they go.
Yeah, that's like loopholes that people are not seeing.
Mm-hmm.
There's tons of loopholes. Almost any country could come here currently and claim political asylum, and they get the opportunity to stay here until their claim is met by an immigration judge, right? And in that time, if they have a baby here, now they have another argument to sway. It's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, and I actually get that argument a lot. I get, hey, Afghans haven't been involved in these terrorist attacks in the United States over the years, so they're not a threat. It's like, no, their passport used to be super weak. It was very, very difficult for an Afghan to get a visa and come to the United States, right? Now it's so easy. They get a tourist or humanitarian visa somewhere in Latin America and they come straight up, right? So the threat landscape has changed because the freedom of movement for some of these people, right? Be it the Indians, Syrians, Chinese. Yeah. Gosh, there's so many Africans seeding their way into the pipelines in the United States, right? This freedom of movement has changed that calculus.
And you say the Africans, is that a threat in your opinion?
Yeah, well, the thing is with the Afghans, right? There's the good guys we want to bring in, and then unfortunately a lot of the bad guys got in. So I think they're a threat to our country, and then they're of course a threat to our allies. As I've brought up some of the examples as to why. Yeah. And remember, a lot of these Afghans are well trained too. So that's another thing you got to keep in mind. We should be most concerned about persons coming from the locations where they actually have had quality training, right? Because they are going to be the biggest threat here in the United States. And I think that's why even people worry about things like the Chinese, right? Like, hey, have these men been through military training, right? That is important. That's an important piece of the calculus.
Yeah, and then you mentioned Africa. There's been several operations from special operations out in Africa trying to dismantle some of the ISIS training camps that are out there as well. And so that makes Africa part of the concern as well, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, and in Africa, there's been wars going on for years. I mean, children go to training camps in Africa, right? I mean, and they're highly trained there too. And remember, in the United States, there aren't that many people trained. I know that sounds really bad, right? But we have a very small percentage of our country who serve in the military. We have a very small percentage of our country compared to some of these places. Like some countries, it's a forced mandatory military training, right? So, we need to keep that in mind too. Don't just, look at a book and be like, oh, he looks fine when he could have been in special operations. There was actually a very senior ISIS leader. He had been the head of special operations for his government's military in Tajikistan, right? He ended up joining ISIS and was one of the best commanders, right? A number of our Benghazi attackers had spent time, in their military before joining a terrorist group. And we see that all the time, in the Pakistan region as well. Like even people serve their entire career and then they don't really know what to do after and they join a terrorist group. So it's very dangerous.
Absolutely. Biden just passed a bill that's going to ban anyone trying to attempt to come into the country illegally and seek asylum. I think this is a good effort. I question why it came so late, but do you feel like this is a good step that's going to protect our country a little bit better?
I mean, it's going to help. I mean, he bans it after 2,500, right? So you can't
Yeah.
get in today, you get in tomorrow. You can't get in tomorrow, you get in the day after. So it's not going to leave the people out who are willing to get in. It's definitely not going to leave the people out who are getting in other ways and not even processing through some sort of checkpoint situation, and it'll just make those pathways obviously more viable. I think it's important, though. I think this is very beneficial to the people serving on the border, right? Because it limits at least the number of people they have to process, right? And maybe they can start to catch up. I don't know if they're ever going to be able to catch up with like 7 to 10 million people coming in the last couple of years. But, you know, people have been asking for this. The thing is, he reversed so many policies. You know, this is now, oh my gosh, this is the second most important topic to American voters. So now we have to do something about it. And unfortunately, it's just politicking.
What's the first? What you said it's the second biggest conversation. What's
economy.
The economy.
Yep.
Yeah, you know, I think it's timely. I think it's kind of if he's trying to please the American people, it's the right time to do it, you know, because it's such a big conversation. Personally, it's nice to see something. I know right. You know, for the political side of it, the game, it sucks, but I'm glad there's something being put in place to kind of slow down a little bit. Right. I think it's going to cause a bigger influx. I think you're going to see some new news reports about massive amounts of migrants at the borders waiting for their time, right? Which is going to cause, you know, the next wave of issues. And with that massive influx that's waiting on the other side, there's probably going to be moments of what we've seen is just a flood the borders, overwhelm the Border Patrol in a kind of free for all. And so, you know, there's every action kind of has a reaction. I think that's what that's going to cause. And especially, I think the night before the election is going to be one of those crazy nights on the border. I'm hoping to be on the border when that happens, because I think it's going to be, if Trump wins, we're all stuck. So they're going to just kind of, it's almost like the changeover of Title 42 again, you know, thoughts.
Well, even the last few years have been that way. People like, let's just get in while we can, right? I mean, even the terrorists are like, let's seed in people now while we can, right? We'll deal with it later. But yeah, this is the time to get people in, and everyone knows it, unfortunately. So the influx is going to continue, even if with an arbitrary number at the border.
Crazy. Well, Sarah, I honestly appreciate your time. Is there any last thoughts you want to leave for the audience? You're more than welcome to.
No, I mean, I just appreciate you having me on. I think, you know, it's important for Americans to understand the national security component of this. I think like everything becomes so political, right? It's like, oh, I don't want to speak out against the border, or, oh, I'm only focused on the border, right? Because of the politics of it. But, you know, screw the politicians, right? They're keeping this broken on both sides, right, to benefit their own political gains. And it's something we need to stop letting them do. And we need to start voting people out who aren't dealing with our national security concerns.
Yeah, I think too many people sometimes don't know that we have to focus both sides, right? Both have to be met equally, and not just the humanitarian mission. We really have to think about the longevity of this country and the safety of this country in the future. And almost everyone, if you talk to them, they might say, yeah, humanitarian. But then if you ask them the question, do you want your kids safe? And they say yes. Okay, well, then you have to also think about homeland security. And so for some reason, it gets looked over too easily. And I think this podcast is absolutely fucking terrifying. And I appreciate it. I appreciate you giving us your experience, your knowledge, your thoughts from your background. I think, you know, this will help a lot of people understand the gravity of what this potentially can have.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Borderland, an Ironclad original. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe everywhere you get your podcasts, and on YouTube at This Is Ironclad.